Hello and welcome to the first of a continuing video series on the history of the United States Navy Armed Guard. What is the United States Navy Armed Guard? To answer that question, let's start by dispelling some misconceptions. The Armed Guard was not a guard for Navy ports, Navy facilities, depots, or buildings, or for that fact, Navy ships. The Armed Guard was a Navy detachment specially trained to protect merchant ships from enemy attacks using various defensive weapons. Before we start diving into the Navy Armed Guard history in World War II, our first step forward should actually be a step backwards in time, many years prior to the start of World War II. Our starting point will be the Great War, or World War I. As the Great War erupts in Europe, President Woodrow Wilson formally proclaims the neutrality of the United States on August 4, 1914, a position that a vast majority of Americans favored at that time. President Wilson stated that America must be impartial in thought as well as in action. In 1914, Britain hoped to cut off supplies from the outside world to Germany. To do this, Britain intends to use its powerful navy to starve Germany and its allies into submission by maintaining a naval blockade of enemy ports. This strategy seemed straightforward at first, but was quite complex. The Royal Navy blockading policy was to bar entrance to the English Channel and the North Sea. This British policy made for difficult relations with neutral countries, particularly the United States. For the first days of the war, German surface raiders and then submarines sought to cut Allied supply lines across the ocean, forming a blockade of their own. Germany declared an exclusion zone around Ireland and the British Isles. Ships within this exclusion zone were subject to seizures, searches, and attacks. Early in the war, in many confrontations, a German submarine could simply surface and overpower an unarmed merchant freighter with their deck guns, thus saving limited and valuable torpedoes for future attacks. Early Allied losses showed this first wave of German submarine warfare produced impressive results. Generally, more than 100,000 tons were sunk each month. Why was merchant shipping so vital to Britain during the Great War? In the early 20th century, Europeans had become highly reliant on overseas supplies of basic materials. Britain imported 100% of its sugar, cocoa, and chocolate, 79% of its grain, 64% of its butters, and 40% of its meats. Nearly 2/3 of the caloric intake of the British people came from abroad. Supplies of industrial material, such as raw material, were completely dependent on imports. By February 1915, the German naval commanders knew that the British merchants were arming their ships, and that both merchant and passenger ships were transporting weapons and supplies from the United States to Europe. As a result, Germany declared the waters surrounding the British Isles a war zone and stopped following international naval prize laws which warned ships of submarines' presence. This break from naval protocol angered and troubled the United States and the European allies. If you were to ask people today a reason for the United States entering the Great War, one of the most common answers would be the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, the British ocean liner was spotted and torpedoed by a German U-boat off the southern coast of Ireland. The ship sank within 18 minutes, leading to the death of 1,198 individuals, 128 of whom were Americans. Numerous other factual reasons for America entering the war existed, but one of the most popular and long remembered was the sinking of the Lusitania by Germany. After the sinking of the Lusitania in May and the Sussex in March of 1916, Germany promised it would not sink any more passenger ships. This promise only lasted a few months. As the Great War drags on through 1916 and into 1917, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II declares on January 31, 1917, to target neutral shipping in a designated war zone. Germany resumed its unrestricted U-boat warfare. At the end of February 1917, a troubled President Wilson asked Congress for the authority to arm American merchant vessels as a deterrent to the newly unleashed German U-boats. President Wilson was still hoping to keep the United States out of the European war and proposed a posture of armed neutrality as a way to do so. On March 1st, the House of Representatives passed the bill he wanted, but it stalled in the Senate. Could an armed American freighter even sink a submarine? The Royal Navy hadn't had much luck so far. However, if the United States did nothing, American shipping across the Atlantic would most certainly dwindle away to almost nothing. The nation would pull back to the safety of its own shores, going it alone, isolated from much of the world. However, if a merchant ship was armed and continued their sailing to Europe, that would put American citizens and American assets in harm's way. There was no splitting the difference. March 13, 1917, disappointed by the failure of the Armed Ships Bill in the Senate to a last-minute filibuster, President Wilson was determined to go forward with the policy of armed neutrality regardless, as the best course to maintain peace with Germany. Having decided that congressional approval was not strictly necessary, he implemented most of the provisions of the Armed Ships Bill by executive order. Unlike World War II and the automatic arming of merchant ships, an interesting twist on President Wilson's arming of merchant ships bill was the U.S. Navy directive for obtaining merchant ship defensive guns. On March 13, 2017, the U.S. Navy Department published its 7-point memorandum regulating the application process and its requirements to merchant shipping companies. Any American flagged vessel which desired armed protection could request naval guns to be installed on their ship, which would be manned by trained officers and sailors of the U.S. Navy. Merchant ship owners were required to ask permission for armed protection, fill out forms, and provide berthing for the Navy sailors and officers who would man the guns. All of this must be done by the owners at the owner's expense. On 13 March 1917, these crews were authorized to fire upon any U-boats in range. Given the German government's announcement that U-boats would be attacking neutral shipping without warning, any U-boat in torpedo range would be deemed an immediate threat. The Americans would not have to wait for the Germans to fire first. This decision to fire would rest entirely upon the Navy gun crews, absolving the civilian captains of any responsibility. Wilson hoped that this measure would deter attacks on American ships and prevent loss of American life. February 3, 1917 through April 4, 1917, Germany sinks a total of 10 American merchant ships. Outraged public opinion now overwhelmingly supported Wilson when he asked Congress for the declaration of war. On March 17, 1917, the SS Mongolia was one of the first merchant ships to be outfitted with guns and to have an armed guard crew assigned. The ship was armed with 3 6-inch 40 caliber guns. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked a special joint session of Congress to declare war on the German Empire. 4 days later, on April 6, 1917, Congress declared war. On April 19, 1917, at 0520 hours, the SS Mongolia was attacked by a German submarine. She fired on the submarine, wrecking the periscope and conning tower, and forced the submarine to submerge. This marked the first U.S. ship encounter with a U-boat after the United States entered the Great War. The following is a brief highlight of some of the actions and events the newly formed Armed Guard encountered during the Great War. The Armed Guard is also present for numerous firsts in the Great War, as we will see in a few minutes. 12 March 1917, President Wilson assigns Navy crews to man deck guns placed aboard American merchant vessels and informs foreign governments of his decision. 15 March, the New York Navy Yard completes installation of guns aboard the passenger liners SS Manchuria, St. Louis, and the steamship New York. 16 March, the passenger liner SS Manchuria becomes the first U.S. armed merchant to sail to the European war zone. It carries 2 4-inch guns forward, 1 6-inch gun aft, 2 1-pounder rapid-fire guns, and 2 Lewis machine guns. 1st April 1917, German U-boat U-46 torpedoes and sinks the steamship SS Aztec off Ushant, France, killing 28 men, including boatswain's mate, First Class John Epicoy of the Navy Armed Guard, the first member of the U.S. Navy killed in the Great War. 5 April, during a British War Cabinet meeting in London, Rear Admiral W.S. Sims urges the adoption of the convoy system to defeat the U-boat threat. 28 April, the Bureau of Ordnance receives authorization for the removal of an additional 180 3-inch 50 caliber guns from warships for the arming of merchant vessels. 20 May 1917, about 200 miles out of New York, an armed guard crew aboard the SS Mongolia starts firing their 6-inch gun for target practice. On the third shot, the gun's brass mouth cup flies in an unexpected direction and strikes a stanchion near several Red Cross nurses, killing 2 of them and wounding a third. 21 May 1917, the Admiralty votes to adopt the convoy system for all merchant shipping 1 day after an experimental convoy safely reaches England from Gibraltar. 5 July 1917, the Bureau of Yards and Docks breaks ground for construction at City Park, Brooklyn, New York, of a naval clearing station for 3,000 Naval Armed Guards. The first men are moved into the camp on 10th of August 1917. 18 July 1917, Chief of the Bureau of Navigation Rear Admiral Lee C. Palmer issues instructions to the officers in charge of Naval Armed Guards aboard merchant ships that, so long as a ship floats on which men of the Navy are performing duty as armed guards, that they should remain thereon and take every opportunity that may present itself to destroy enemy submarines. This came in response to a report that armed guards abandoned vessels after being struck by torpedoes while a ship remained afloat for a considerable time thereafter. 22 July, the convoy system is inaugurated in the Mediterranean Sea by order of the British Admiralty. 6 August 1917, the armed steamer SS Capana encounters a German submarine U-61 in the Mediterranean Sea and engages in a running gun duel for several hours, before finally running out of ammunition and being forced to abandon ship. The Germans capture the ship, remove valuable instrumentation, and then sink her with scuttling charges. Before departing, the Germans take the Capana's captain, Alfred Oliver, and 5 members of the Navy Armed Guard as prisoners of war. These are the first Americans taken prisoner in the Great War. 19 August 1917, German U-boats attack an American convoy of troop transports while approaching the French coast. Although no ships are lost, the attacks badly disorganized control of the convoy, calling into question policies of escort protection as naval armed guards aboard the transports almost hit the escorting destroyers with gunfire. 16 January 1918. In the evening hours, approximately 100 miles out of Liverpool, England, the armed guard aboard the steamer SS New York spot a barrel-shaped object on the port beam at about 1,800 yards away and fire 5 rounds from the 3-inch gun and 2 from the 6-inch gun. Their unidentified target is the destroyer Jenkins, DD-42. One of New York's shells ricochets off the water, passing through a stanchion on the after deck house, killing 1 Navy seaman and wounding 4 others. March 1918, the Navy Armed Guard aboard the tanker SS Paulsboro began a running gun duel with an enemy submarine. By elevating the ship's guns beyond the sight scale, the Armed Guard is able to get the range of the submarine and drop shells directly on her. The submarine breaks off pursuit and submerges in a little under an hour, having fired 50 rounds, 88 3-inch shells. 1 crew member suffers a shrapnel injury, but otherwise the tanker makes port unscathed. 14 April 1918, U-151 departs Kiel, Germany, for the United States, the first time a German submarine sailed to the Western Atlantic intent on attacking shipping. 10 October 1918, the Admiralty and the U.S. Navy Department agreed to Plan BCR, a joint plan to protect troop convoys destined for France from German raiders. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a ceasefire is initiated. The Navy Department announces that upon written request of the owner, it will authorize the removal of the Navy Armed Guard battery, equipment, and personnel attached to the armed vessel, with the exception of the radio men and the radio equipment, which will be left on board. The Navy orders that the Armed Guard be disbanded. Sailors from the Armed Guard are absorbed back into the fleet or are discharged from service. The gun batteries and associated accoutrements are removed from armed merchant vessels. The wooden barracks in Brooklyn City Park are demolished. So ends the Armed Guard's service in the Great War. The War Department published orders in April 1919 and the Navy in June of that same year for a Victory Medal. The Victory Medal was awarded to military personnel for service between April 6, 1917 and November 11, 1918. In addition to the medal, members of the Armed Guard were authorized to wear a Navy operational clasp. In 1945, a similar recognition is not awarded to World War II Armed Guard members. During the Great War, Armed Guard operations showed that approximately 30,000 men were assigned to the Navy Armed Guard. They served on approximately 384 United States merchant vessels. 42 Armed Guard merchant vessels were lost, 36 to enemy action. A total of 58 Armed Guard sailors were lost during this period. In a short period of time, the Navy was able to create a specialized service to protect merchant ships that included all the logistics tied to its service. As the Great War would be the last war of its kind, the assumption was that this type of service was never to be needed in the future. Many records are lost or not kept, and lessons learned are soon forgotten. I hope you enjoyed the history of the U.S. Navy Armed Guard origins and a sampling of the actions that they were involved in during the Great War. Please look for my next video, like this video and share. Hit the subscribe button for my channel. If you are visiting the Baltimore, Maryland area, please plan a visit to the United States Navy National Armed Guard Museum on board the Liberty ship, the SS John W. Brown. If you are unable to make it to Baltimore, please consider a donation to Project Liberty ship, SS John W. Brown, at this link.